Your brain is the real instrument. Close your eyes for a second and think about a lyric you misheard as a kid. Someone told you the correct words, and suddenly you couldn't unhear them. That flip wasn't in your ears, it was in your cortex. Hearing is active. Your brain guesses what should be there, then updates those guesses on the fly. The sound you experience is the brain's best story about the pressure wiggles hitting your eardrum. Psychoacoustics studies how that story gets built. Start with masking. When a loud sound and a quiet one sit close together in frequency or time, the loud one makes the quiet one disappear. Not physically, perceptually. The inner ear analyzes sound into overlapping filters called critical bands. Within a band, strong energy raises the threshold for hearing weaker details. So that soft brush of a finger on a string hides under a bright cymbal hit, even though both are technically present. Masking isn't just spectral, it's temporal too. A loud event can mask sounds just before and after it, thanks to how the auditory system integrates energy over short windows. That's why a sharp snare crack can wipe out tiny details bracketing it. Perceptual coders like MP3 and AAC exploit this. If the ear wouldn't notice a component because it's masked, throw it away. The lesson isn't that compression ruins music, it's that your hearing system has blind spots, and smart engineering uses them. Critical bands also explain why EQ feels non-linear to us. Add a dB at 1 kHz, and you might hear it more readily than a dB at 15 kHz, because our sensitivity peaks around the speech region, and because bandwidths stretch with frequency. Loudness itself is non-linear. Equal? Loudness contours show that bass needs more energy to feel as loud as mids at low listening levels. So the same track can feel thin or full depending on volume, even if nothing else changes. Your perception isn't a meter, it's a moving target shaped by biology. Now layer prediction on top. The brain uses context and memory to fill gaps. In noisy rooms, you hear missing phonemes in speech based on expectation. Music isn't exempt. If the groove implies a kick, you might perceive a kick's presence more strongly than the raw waveform alone would suggest. This is why tiny dropouts can go unnoticed in a busy mix, and why you can follow a melody through a wall of sound. You're completing patterns. All of this creates trouble for simple gear claims. When someone swaps cables and everything opens up, what changed? Hardware or expectation? That doesn't mean differences never exist. It means our perception is easy to steer. The clean way to keep ourselves honest is blind testing. ABX testing is straightforward. You have two known references, A and B, and an unknown X that's either A or B. Your job is to identify X across multiple trials. If you can do it reliably, there's a real, audible difference. If you can't, maybe the change is smaller than your beliefs suggest, or buried by other variables like room noise, headphone response, or mastering. Here's a micro story that plays out a lot. A group sits down to compare a high-res file with the same CD version. They go cited first. People nod and trade adjectives. Then someone normalizes levels, runs an ABX plugin, and routes both files through the same DAC. The hit rate sinks toward chance. It's not that the group is wrong to love what they thought they heard. It's that the brain is doing what it always does, mixing expectation, context, and sensory input into a confident perception. Confidence isn't the same as accuracy. Stakes time. If perception is constructed, what should fidelity even mean? We could chase measurements beyond human limits, or we could aim at perceptual transparency. No audible difference under normal conditions. That's the idea behind standards like 44.1 kHz, 16-bit, and behind design choices like Dither and filter shapes. Engineering for ears, not oscilloscopes, is a philosophical choice, and it's shaped how music is made, mastered, and sold. There's another twist. Attention. Ritual changes what we perceive. The act of lowering a needle, cleaning a record, and sitting still primes you to listen more deeply. Many analog sounds better. Moments are really, I listened better moments, amplified by euphonic distortions we happen to like. Conversely, streaming on earbuds while walking through traffic creates a ceiling on how much nuance you'll notice, no matter the sample rate. So before we argue formats, admit the first truth. Your brain is the instrument. It masks, it predicts, it fills, it misleads with conviction. That's not a flaw. It's a feature that makes music resilient. You can enjoy a song through a tinny phone speaker because your cortex does heroic work. And it's why cleverly designed digital systems can discard data you'd never miss. If the brain is guessing, the next question is practical. What exactly are we feeding it? How does vibrating air become numbers that can be stored, edited, streamed, and turned back into motion with vanishingly small audible loss? To understand why good enough in digital is often very good indeed, and when it isn't, we need to talk sampling the simple way. How often to measure, what to keep, and how to avoid fooling ourselves with the wrong details. Let's turn sound into numbers without losing the music. Turning air into numbers. Sampling without the scary math. Start with the air. A singer opens their mouth, the vocal folds buzz, and pressure ripples race through the room. A microphone's diaphragm wiggles with those ripples and turns motion into voltage. That voltage is still analog, continuous. To store it, we take snapshots. Not photographs in space, but measurements in time. How often? That's the heart of sampling. Here's the promise that changed music. If you sample at least twice as fast as the highest frequency you care about, you can reconstruct the original band-limited signal perfectly. That's the Nyquist-Shannon idea, minus the math headache. Human hearing tops out near 20 kilohertz for most listeners, so a rate just over 40 kilohertz covers it. Compact disc settled on 44.1 kilohertz to leave a little room to work with. But there's a catch. Real-world sounds try to shove energy above the limit. If you don't guard the door, those ultrasonics fold back into the audible band as bogus tones, aliasing. So we filter before sampling, using an anti-aliasing filter that rolls off anything we can't safely capture. Think of it like a bouncer at a club, checking IDs. Under 22 kilohertz? You're in. That pre-filtering is why we talk about band-limited signals. Now, real filters aren't brick walls. They need a transition zone to fade from pass to stop. That's where the extra 4.1 kilohertz above 40 kilohertz helps. It gives designers a buffer so the audible band stays flat and clean while the filter does its work just outside it. Higher sample rates like 96 kilohertz widen that buffer dramatically, letting engineers design gentler filters with fewer artifacts near the top of our hearing. That's a real benefit for implementation, but it doesn't magically reveal dog whistle harmonics you couldn't hear anyway. Big misconception time. Higher sample rates capture timing better. It sounds right until you look closer. Sampling at 44.1 kilohertz doesn't mean you can only place events on a 1/44th 100-second grid. After reconstruction, timing information exists between those samples because the signal is band-limited and the interpolation is continuous. The math guarantees you can recover the shape, including zero crossings and transients, within the audible band. So no, the snare's snap doesn't smear just because the snapshots are 22.7 microseconds apart. The limiting factor in practice is more often the microphone, the room, and the analog chain than the sample clock. That said, filters matter for how those snaps feel. Early digital systems sometimes use steep linear phase filters close to the audible band, which could introduce pre-ringing on test signals, little ripples before a transient. Engineers heard that as a kind of etch on certain percussive sounds. Modern approaches shifted to gentler or minimum phase filters, pushing any ringing to the afterside of the transient or moving it higher in frequency where it's less noticeable. Bump the sample rate, and you can push all of that further into irrelevance. The point isn't that 44.1 kilohertz is flawed, it's that filter design is a craft, and higher rates give more elbow room. Another myth. 96 kilohertz captures more frequencies, so it must sound better. It captures more measurable ultrasonic content, yes, but unless you're a bat, that extra spectrum isn't directly audible. Where it can matter is in direct, nonlinear processors. Some plugins, saturators, or even analog gear can mix ultrasonics back down into the audible range as intermodulation products. In production, oversampling or higher project rates help keep those ghosts out. On playback of a finished, well-mastered file, there shouldn't be rogue ultrasonics to begin with. Let's talk about transients, because that's where people feel differences. Our ears are sensitive to onset cues. The exact moment a stick hits a snare, the click on a bass string. Those cues don't require infinite bandwidth. They require faithful reproduction of the audible band and wise filter choices. A well-designed 44.1 system gets that right. A poorly designed 192 system can still get it wrong. Implementation trumps numbers. Micro story. A drummer swears their high-rate stems feel faster. The engineer prints two mixes from the same session. One at 96 kHz downsampled well to 44.1, one natively at 44.1 using a sharp old filter. Blind. The drummer prefers the downsampled version. What changed wasn't sample rate. It was filtering quality and headroom choices during mixing. The lesson: the path matters. Meanwhile, the analog front end does the heavy lifting. The mic, preamp, and converter's analog filter set up what the digital side can even see. Quiet circuits with stable clocks and well-behaved filters make more difference than chasing a huge rate your system can't handle cleanly. And once captured properly, turning those samples back into motion, the DAC step, uses a reconstruction filter to stitch the dots into a smooth wave. Same story. Give the filter space to breathe, avoid ringing in the audible band, and keep noise and distortion low. So sampling, done right, isn't a crude staircase. It's a careful tracing of what we can hear, with guardrails that keep fakes out. Higher rates offer engineering comfort and headroom in production. Standard rates aim at perceptual transparency and playback. If numbers alone don't guarantee sound, what does? Depth. How finely we measure loudness between those time points sets the floor for noise in the shape of quiet. That's bit depth, quantization, and the little trick that makes errors disappear into hiss instead of grit. Let's go there. Bit depth, quantization, and the magic of Dither. We've set how often we measure. Now we need to decide how finely we measure loudness. That's bit depth. Each sample isn't a perfect, infinite precision voltage. It has to land on one of a set of steps. With 16 bits, you get 65,536 possible levels. With 24 bits, about 16.7 million. More steps mean smaller gaps between them. Those gaps create quantization error. When the true signal sits between steps, the converter rounds it to the nearest one. That rounding is a kind of distortion. It isn't random. Left alone, it correlates with the music. On quiet material, it can turn into low-level grittiness, a faint, zipper-like texture riding the tails of notes. That's not the vibe anyone wants on a piano decay. Enter Dither, the gentlest magic trick in digital audio. You add a tiny amount of noise, yes, add, to the signal before quantizing. That push randomizes the rounding error so it no longer tracks the music. Instead of correlated distortion, you get uncorrelated noise, which our ears find far less objectionable. Properly chosen Dither can make a 16-bit render behave audibly like a system with much finer resolution at the threshold of hearing. How small is the noise? With standard triangular Dither on a 16-bit file, the noise floor lands around -93 to -96 dBFS, depending on shaping. In a real room, FASE and outside rumble sit higher than that. Even in quiet studios, ambient noise often dominates long before Dither does. The trade is simple. A whisper of hiss replaces a hint of grit, and the music's microdynamics remain intact. Noise shaping takes the trick further. Our ears are less sensitive at very high frequencies, especially at modest listening levels. So you can tilt the Dither's energy upward, reduce noise where we hear best, push more where we don't. Shape Dither keeps mid-band decays cleaner without changing the underlying 16-bit limit. It doesn't create information, it hides the cost where we're least likely to notice it. Let's anchor the numbers. 16 bits by roughly 96 dB of theoretical dynamic range. 24 bits push that to about 144 dB. On paper, 24-bit looks wildly better. In practice, playback chains rarely get close to those extremes. Your listening room, even at night, lives around 30 to 40 dB SPL. Comfortable peaks hover around 80 to 85 dB SPL. A clean system already covers that span with headroom at 16-bit. The extra depth matters more when you're working on the music than when you're playing it back. Production is where 24-bit shines. Recording at 24-bit lets engineers leave generous headroom, no need to slam levels near full scale, and still bury the converter's noise far below the quietest, meaningful detail. Every EQ move, compressor pass, and reverb sum piles math on math. Wider word lengths and higher internal precision keep rounding noise from creeping in. Non-linear processes like saturation or limiting can spit out low-level byproducts. Extra depth keeps those artifacts from quantization splatter until the very end. Then, at delivery, you downshift deliberately. You render to 16-bit for distribution and apply Dither once at the last step. Done right, that final file is perceptually transparent to the 24-bit mix it came from under normal listening conditions. Not kind of close, transparent. The audible signature of the work survives the drop in numeric resolution because the drop is managed. Microstory. A pianist records a solo piece in a quiet hall. The engineer prints two versions, one 16-bit with no dither, one 16-bit with shaped dither. In the control room, they loop the last 2 seconds of a long chord. On the undithered render, the decay hits a faint, rough shelf, like it steps down a staircase and stops. On the dithered render, it breathes out to black with a hair of hiss. Blind, the pianist picks the dithered one every time. The music feels like it ends, not that it falls off a cliff. There's a myth that more bits make things sound fuller at any volume. Bits don't change tonality or punch directly. They set the smallest step size, and by extension, the noise floor and low-level linearity. If a 24-bit playback file sounds better than the 16-bit version, check what else changed. Different master, different loudness, or a poor 16-bit conversion with missing dither. The format label often gets credit or blame for the process. Quantization error isn't always the villain. Sometimes engineers want the grid on purpose. Old samplers and early digital boxes had limited resolution, and their crunch became a texture people love. Those devices didn't dither. They spat correlated errors that read as byte and edge. Today's plugins emulate that by switching off dither, truncating, or modeling quantizer behavior. Proof that bad becomes good when it's chosen and framed. So where should you care about bit depth? Care deeply during capture and mixing. Use 24-bit, leave headroom, keep the chain quiet. Care at export. Always dither when reducing bit depth, and do it once, last, after any fades. For playback, don't panic about 16-bit when the master is solid and the room is louder than the noise floor. The art lives above the floor anyway. This is the pattern you'll see again and again. Digital audio admits its limits, then shapes those limits around human hearing. Quantization creates distortion. Dither turns it into almost nothing. We keep what matters and put the cost where you won't feel it. With depth handled, the next sales pitch shows up. Higher resolution files. If the floor is already below your room, what's the upgrade really buying? Let's test the promise and the perception. High-res audio, what it promises versus what we perceive. Here's the sales pitch in one breath. Jump to 24-bit, raise the sample rate to 96 or 192 kilohertz, and you'll unlock detail you've been missing, air around cymbals, room tone blooming, piano hammers snapping into focus. Under the hood, the claim isn't totally empty. Higher rates push filter work far away from our hearing, and longer words drop the noise floor. On paper, it's comforting. More room, more precision, fewer edge cases that could bite. Start with sample rate. At 96 or 192 kilohertz, engineers get wide transition bands for their anti-alias and reconstruction filters. That breathing room means gentler slopes and less chance of ripple or phase weirdness near 20 kilohertz. It also eases plugin design for nonlinear processes, saturation, clipping, certain virtual analog models where ultrasonics can intermodulate and fold back as junk. In studios, that headroom is useful. For consumer playback, you're ideally listening to a final master that already cleaned this up. There shouldn't be rogue ultrasonics left to cause trouble. Now, bit depth. 24 bits theoretically give about 144 dB of dynamic range. That's far below the noise of most rooms and electronics, and near or below the threshold of human hearing across most of the spectrum. The practical win is in production. You can record conservatively, peaks at, say, minus 12 dBFS, without flirting with quantization errors, and every DSP step keeps rounding error down. By the time it hits your player, a well-dithered 16-bit file can be perceptually transparent to the 24-bit source in normal listening. If a 24-bit download sounds better, check whether you're actually hearing a different master. So can people hear high res? Controlled tests complicate the hype. In a widely cited year-long series, Meyer Moran 2007, listeners, from engineers to audiophiles, tried to tell high-res playback from the same signal passed through a CD quality bottleneck. Their overall score hovered near chance, essentially random guessing. That doesn't mean nobody ever hears differences. Some studies and anecdotes show trained listeners doing slightly better on material with wide dynamics, clean acoustic spaces, or sharp percussion, especially under quiet conditions and with revealing speakers. But the effect when present is subtle and it's not universal. Let's talk bottlenecks. The mastering decision tree can swamp format deltas. A modern pop master might be limited hard, clipped gently, EQ for impact on phones, and normalized for streaming loudness targets. Swap to a high-res version from a label that used a less crushed master. And of course, it feels nicer. People credit the container, but it was the mix and master. Vinyl pushes different decisions too. More headroom, different EQ to cope with groove constraints, so it can sound better even if the raw technical spec is lower. Playback chains matter more than most spec sheets admit. Room acoustics dominate with speakers. A null at 80 Hz from your couch placement erases bass detail that number 192 kHz file can rescue. Headphones vary wildly. Their frequency responses can differ by 5 to 10 dB in the treble. That dwarfs anything formats are fighting over. DACs and amps, once competently designed, converge. Low noise, flat response, distortion below audibility. Past that line, attention and preference take over. Streaming adds another twist, take over. Streaming adds another twist. Some services label streams high-res, but deliver them through paths that may resample, transcode, or apply volume leveling. Bluetooth is its own maze. Most codecs are lossy, and even many lossless over Bluetooth claims involve compression that isn't truly bit-perfect end-to-end. In a subway car at 70 dB ambient noise, the floor is miles above any theoretical gain. At home, wired or stable lossless wireless with decent headphones can finally make a fair fight. But then, mastering and room step back in as the big players. There are real but narrow cases where high RARs can help at the consumer end. Transient, rich acoustic recordings mastered gently, played loudly in a quiet room on a revealing system, can expose minor differences in filter design. Minimum phase filters at high rates may sidestep pre-ringing entirely within audibility, which some describe as cleaner cymbal leading edges. The improvement is subtle, and you can often approximate it by choosing a good DAC filter at standard rates. Still, some listeners swear they feel a touch more ease. Micro story. A jazz trio records live to 24-192. The release goes out in 3 forms: a carefully noise-shaped 16's 44.1, a 2496, and a 24-192. In a blind, level-match session on big monitors, the producer and drummer correctly picked the 2496 over the 16's 44.1, slightly above chance on busy ride patterns. But they can't separate 2496 from 24-192 reliably. Later, they repeat the test on headphones and the edge disappears. Takeaway: conditions matter and returns diminish fast. So what does high RARs promise? Engineering, comfort, margin for error, and marketing clarity. What do we perceive? Often less than the brochure implies, especially when mastering, rooms, and transducers dominate. If you enjoy the peace of mind, or if your catalog happens to use better masters in high-res stores, great. Enjoy it. Just anchor expectations. Past a competent baseline, the biggest audible wins usually come from choices, not container size. Which raises the next question. If many differences we hear aren't about sample rate or bit depth, where do they come from? Decisions in mastering. That's where records get their punch, their space, and their feel, and where formats start to diverge for reasons that have nothing to do with ultrasonic content. The mastering variable. Why different releases sound different.